This show is brought to you in part by viewers like you who joined a Patreon or become YouTube members. Thank you. And if you could, hit the like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. So something happened that was very interesting this week that I don't think many people caught or talked about. You know, I watched the video and it was only 3,000 people that had viewed the video on CBS's channel. And we got to see on a podcast Andrew Berry talked to James Gladstone. If you don't know who James Gladstone is, that is the general manager of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Yes, we got to see on one podcast Andrew Berry and the GM of the Jacksonville Jaguars talk about how they got into the trade. Like, it was very, very interesting to see that. I don't think I've ever seen something like that happen. And I thought to myself when I saw it and didn't see much people talking about it, this is the exact kind of thing that I want to bring to as many Browns fans as possible. So we're going to go over this video, talk about some of the things that I thought were interesting and react to this video. There's a lot there, right? We were talking about two GMs talking publicly on a podcast that openly did a trade months ago. So first here, if you want to know how the trade details came about, what the timeline was, this is the clip that plays that out.
So I'll just ask this quickly, and then Rand, you can take over. I'll get my question here. So how did that conversation begin when you're, number one, you're a young GM, so you may not know as many GMs as an older GM might. And then how did it go from there to get to the point where you guys were able to consummate that draft trade?
Yeah, I think, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong along the way here with the finer details. The farther we get away from it, the foggier it gets. But nonetheless, I think the owner meetings, it served as a good touch point for many of the general managers, especially for those that are first time in the seat. And that was where Andrew and I were able to make an initial touch point, though brief. And from there, once our internal leadership dynamic was beginning to have deeper dialogue about the draft itself, reached out to a few teams there in front of us, and Andrew being one who showed some level of openness to have a larger conversation. And that continued to include more details with a few additional touch points as time went on. But nonetheless, I think it was roughly 2 weeks out from the draft that we really had a strong framework for what ultimately ended up being what we were able to execute once Cleveland was officially on the clock. And, I got to give a lot of credit to Andrew for being as professional and graceful and as clear of a communicator as he was throughout that process. I'd like to think that that's what every trade is going to look like in the future. But at the same time, I think if I do, I'm setting myself up for disappointment. But I can't say at this point, with them feeling like it was what was in the best interest of their franchise, us feeling like it was in the best interest of where we were and what we felt like was best for the future. I think it's been an enjoyable process to date, and I think it can be a win-win.
So what's interesting is that the Jaguars had the idea of trading for Travis Hunter around the owners' meetings in February. And then about 2 weeks before the draft, the Cleveland Browns and the Jaguars already had a framework for a deal worked out, which meant that the Browns were pretty close to a deal with Jacksonville, or at least had one in place 2 weeks before the draft. And that's interesting because it also seems like 2 weeks before the draft, the noise about the Browns definitely taking Travis Hunter amplified. This is where we started to hear Andrew Berry in his press conference before the draft talk about how Travis is like he was throwing heavy out there that he was going to take Travis Hunter while still having the framework of his deal in place. And I think that basically confirms a theory that a lot of Browns fans had, which is Andrew Berry wasn't selling Travis Hunter to us. Andrew Berry was selling Travis Hunter to the Jaguars, right? He was enticing them to maybe add that second round pick to the deal, or maybe add that extra first round pick to the deal. He was trying to sweeten the pot. I think he caught on very early that there was a team that was infatuated with Travis Hunter right around the owners meeting. And you know what's interesting about all of that? The noise in the interview clips that came up of Travis Hunter and Andrew Berry talking about Travis Hunter as if he's Shohei Ohtani, which I don't know if Andrew believes or not. But it is interesting that they mention that these conversations started at the owners meeting. Well, not these conversations, the intention, right? They knew by the time they got to the owners meeting, Jacksonville, that they wanted Travis Hunter more than any other player in this draft. And that's when they started talking to the Browns. And then right around that same time, here's Andrew Berry on the podcast talking about how Shohei Ohtani and Travis Hunter are similar, making arguments for Travis Hunter. Like, it is quite interesting when that all started and when this timeline was kind of laid out. And in 2 weeks before the draft, that's when they had the framework worked out. So it goes to show you, just when you think you know what Andrew Berry's doing, you don't. That was humbling, right? You know, because I was convinced that they were going to take Travis Hunter. Everything about what they were doing screamed that they were going to take Travis Hunter. And that's good gamesmanship on Andrew Berry's part, right? You know, the Browns wanted to get the most out of that number 2 overall pick that they could get. And they did not feel like selecting a player was going to do that more than getting all the assets that they got in return for that. Or at least that would be what's best for the Cleveland Browns going forward. We'll see how that works out for the Cleveland Browns. Again, there's scenarios where this could be a home run for the Browns, right? Let's say the Browns make this trade and Mason Graham becomes a 10-year all-pro level guy, and then with that extra first-round pick, you net a quarterback from that, then yeah, it don't matter how good Travis Hunter is, you win that trade. There are ways where this could be a disaster for Cleveland. You know, Mason Graham's not as good as you want him to be. Quincy Junkins doesn't really work out. And then Travis Hunter becomes an all-pro guy, and we're talking about Julio Jones trade all over again. It can really go either way. There's no real way to declare a winner right now. It's way too early. I mean, it's laughably early to declare a winner in that trade. But that's kind of how that trade came out, and it kind of makes sense when you look at the timeline of when Andrew was really, you know, pumping up Travis Hunter, and it probably lays some insight into why it was that Andrew was saying these things publicly about Travis when that's not something he normally does. So it's an interesting thing to note. Let's jump into this clip.
This gives us really the opportunity to walk a number of different paths. Really entering the off season, coming off of a disappointing year and having uncertainty around the quarterback position, as well as a core group of players that were really approaching the end of their career. We knew we were due for a little bit of a strategic pivot, and that could mean a variety of ways when you're sitting with the number 2 pick. Probably the most direct path is you take a young quarterback, hit on him, and it's the most important position in sports. One of the alternative paths is you take a non-quarterback, in this position, potentially the best player in the draft with Travis, and someone that the league hasn't really seen before in terms of a two-way player. And then the third avenue, which you've seen teams really like Philadelphia and Detroit maybe walk this route, where you're able to take a very good player, but significantly increase the amount of resources that you have to build the team over a multi-year time horizon. And, I remember one of the first conversations we had with James, and he expressed the interest in coming up. I was like, hey, essentially, well, what are you thinking? Is this because, Rand and James, you both know this, that some inquiries are just more calls to check the box, and then others are actually serious inquiries. I remember telling James, I was like, we're in a position where we're probably either going to take a quarterback or we'll take the best player in the draft. So for us to move off of the pick, it's got to be something significant that really helps our organization over the long run. And James was serious because, look, Travis is a really good player. He's a really good player. And I would be shocked if he's not a really good player for a long time in Jacksonville. But for us, where our team's life cycle was, we felt like that was a real meaningful opportunity for us to get another very good player, but really kind of replenish the resources that we have to build the team over this year next.
Forward. There's a term in there that I think is interesting that he used, a strategic pivot. Now, that is corporate for rebuilding, change of direction, all that stuff, right? That's what a strategic pivot is. It's okay, well, Deshaun Watson stinks. And again, if you needed more confirmation, the Cleveland Browns have no future plans for Deshaun Watson on this football team going forward. Andrew basically said it there again. Same thing with Kevin has said things that have illuminated that. And, Jimmy Haslam outright said it. So there's definitely a strategic pivot going on. I feel like that's obvious, but if you needed it confirmed, there's the confirmation. And he talked about these 3 avenues to make a pivot, right? Number one way to make a pivot is to use the number 2 overall selection on a quarterback. The second way to make a pivot to Andrew Berry was to take the best player in the draft. And it is interesting that in this circumstance, Andrew Berry separated the conversation of best player in the draft to taking a quarterback. Sometimes, a lot of times, when you're taking a quarterback at 2, the quarterback is one of the best players in the draft. Like, it's interesting that this year he felt it necessary to say, hey, that's a separate path than where we want to go. And in 3, the Philly route, which is to take a quarterback in the later rounds and surround that quarterback with as much talent as possible. Now, this is something that I think the Browns are going to be attracted to. I think this is how the Browns, if they do not fall into a generational quarterback prospect, right, would like the team to be built. I think they see a golden opportunity here. They have 2 quarterbacks on the roster that they like. Whether you like Dillon Gabriel or not, whether you like Shedeur Sanders or not, the truth is that the Cleveland Browns organization liked these guys enough to spend some draft assets on them, right? Dillon Gabriel, they spent a 3rd-round pick 90. If we're trying to quantify pick 90 into points, right, that's about... One quick correction to this section of the video that I want to insert real quick is a correction to the math that I used on the chart. Should not include pick 144's value in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, is that the name of it? Yeah, Fitzgerald Spielberger's draft chart. I should only include the 2 picks that the Browns used to trade for Shedeur, and then juxtapose that with the value of the pick that they used for Dillon Gabriel. And my whole point is, the picks that they gave up to get Shedeur at pick 144, it's a similar value on that chart and on most trade charts to what pick 94 is. Now, that's a bit abstract, how much you value a pick in the top 100 versus 2 6-round picks. All I'm saying is that the investment level that the Browns have in Shedeur Sanders, in Dillon Gabriel, and in Kenny Pickett are all very, very similar. You can even say with Joe Flacco, even though they have much less invested in Joe Flacco than they do in Shedeur, Dillon, and Kenny, and they don't really have much invested in those guys. But the Browns really don't have a dog in this race. They didn't spend a ton of assets for one individual player that they've brought in. They've kind of spent the same amount of assets to bring in these guys, depending on how you value draft versus money versus picks versus trades and all of that. There's an argument there to be said that all 3 of these guys kind of got brought in, and they're being brought in on the same level. And eventually, if they prove that they're all capable of competing for the starting job, they're likely to be judged on the same level. I tend to think the Browns quarterback room has like 3 different paths of going, right? 2 of them preferred, 1 of them not preferred. And the not preferred one is that you just don't find a quarterback in this batch, right? But either the Browns quarterback room shows some promise from its rookies, right? Shedeur Sanders steps up, looks like a starter during the season. Dillon Gabriel steps up, looks like a starter during the season. And that puts the Browns in a position to where it really wouldn't make sense to go after a quarterback, because let's say the Browns, they're a fringe like 9-win, 10-win team. Their quarterback's playing well. Then maybe it doesn't make sense to take a quarterback at 22 or a pick along those ranks, right? And let's say Jacksonville's in the same boat and they're at pick 19, and maybe those two picks aren't going to net you one of the top quarterbacks in that draft class. And if that's the case, then that's fine. You'll just roll with whichever rookie quarterback showed the most promise in 2026 and continue to use those assets around that quarterback to make the team better. I think they feel like that Philly plan is their most realistic option, right? I don't think the Browns see themselves as a team that's going to be picking in the top 5 anytime soon. So they feel like their best bet to fix the quarterback position is that route. Now, if the Browns get the opportunity for whatever reason to take a generational quarterback prospect, if one is available, I think they do it, right? And I don't think it would matter what happens with the quarterbacks this year. If one of these dudes look like Joe Burrow in college, you're going to take that guy and you're just going to move on. And hopefully you can move one of the guys you drafted this year for extra assets to make your team even better. So that was an interesting section of the podcast. Here's another one.
Everyone sees the trade and, knows that it goes down on draft night, but they don't understand the communication that happens within the organization to make this happen. So could you talk about your communication processes with your respective owners, your head coach, your staff, the coaching staff? Can you just give us the parameters of how that goes down for our viewers?
Yeah.
It is not, these trades aren't a situation where just James and I talk and then, 6 hours later, hey, deal's done, we're going to move forward. At times I joke as a general manager, you have to be a little bit the majority whip, for any type of big decision. And so from our perspective, the context that I would kind of give our listeners is, for the whole spring, we're traveling the country to get to know a select group of prospects that we might consider with the number 2 pick. And it goes from a point where you hear about them at the school and you watch them on the film to where you truly start to get to know them and build a relationship and, meet their support system and everything. And, when
I thought that comment was interesting. I wanted to pause the video for this. He said, sometimes you have to act like a majority whip. Now, for those of you who do not know what a majority whip is in government, is a member of a party, right? It could be the left or the right, but it's a member of a political party who spends a lot of their time making sure that the members of that party are going to be willing to vote for legislation, laws that the party is currently proposing. It's somebody who whips the votes in line, right? And it's an interesting thing for Andrew to compare this process to, because it tells you that there are a lot of times, oftentimes, where a GM might want to get a move done, but maybe the coach doesn't want to do it. Maybe ownership's not a big fan of it, right? And part of Andrew's job and the job of his most trusted people around him are to help make those arguments to those people about why it is that we need to make this move. And again, it just tells you why trades don't manifest themselves that much and just how much bureaucracy, my bad, goes into trying to figure out or trying to determine who's going to trade for who, and why trades tend to break down so much, because there's so much in the way of making that decision. And that tells you how the Browns operate, right? Andrew's not really just going to make a unilateral decision. Kevin's not allowed to make a unilateral decision. And oftentimes when unilateral decisions have been made, they have come from ownership. And that's why those decisions, if they don't work out, tend to stick out like a sore thumb compared to how Cleveland usually operates. It is interesting, right, when you really dig into what Andrew's saying and what he's trying to communicate, especially when he has his guard down a little bit in this interview. And I think that's an interesting little nugget there to think about, how Andrew kind of views his job on a day-to-day basis.
And you're picking as high as we were, you can kind of envision them, in your program, envision them on the field in your building. And as you work deeper in the process, like you do develop like a natural attachment to, to these people, right? They're people first and players second. And so, when that happens, when, James presented, an opportunity to consummate a deal, it's like, okay, we want to be very thoughtful about this because we've done a lot of work on these individuals. We feel like it's a very short list that can make a major impact for the organization, both on the field and in the locker room. And let's make sure that we're considering all elements of this. So from our perspective, like where we've gone, to James's point, from year 1 to year 6, there's call it a small cross-functional group that I would call like our senior cabinet, that would have a number of different lenses: research and strategy, scouting, contract management, things like that, where it's not everybody who's necessarily like-minded and looking at essentially the pros and cons of the transaction. Obviously, loop Kevin into it. It's like, hey, this is maybe a little bit of a detour that we thought could be available, but now there's actually a route that we can take if we choose to do so. Here are the pros, here are the cons. And then once there's, I'd say, maybe an initial view or recommendation, looping ownership in to get their perspective as well. Because, and so that's something that has to be a collaborative discussion, before you make decision. That's not something that should be or could be done unilaterally.
That was perfect. And you hit on, I hope our viewers will understand, now after hearing both of you guys speak about it, that it isn't just a quick and simple thing. You hear it and you see it all the time from fans. Why didn't we trade? Why didn't we trade back? Why didn't we trade up? A lot of times you have to have a partner, and everyone in the organization has to be on board with making these things happen. So it's not as easy as pulling a trade on Madden, because I know my son's in there playing Madden now, trying to consummate trades, and he's seeking my approval on it. But anyway.
So that was them detailing basically how a trade goes down. And it is important to know, right? Because anytime a trade happens, people just assume that every team had the ability to make a trade, whether it be in a draft or for a player. Like, for example, some people got mad at the Browns when Geno Smith got traded. And the assumption there is that the Seattle Seahawks were just shopping Geno Smith to every single GM that they know. The reality is, much like how people interact with any other job, you're not just going to put somebody on an official trading block and just say, hey, man, send me the best offer. That's just not how that works. This isn't Facebook Marketplace. And I think a lot of people think that the trade market in the NFL operates as Facebook Marketplace, and that the price is known publicly, and that you just got to go on NFLplayermarketplace.com to see who's available and to make a trade there. The truth about trades is that they take a personal connection to whatever GM is trying to trade them, and they take months to figure out. Even this trade that the Browns did took a month to figure out. So it's not as simple like, oh, they made that trade, why couldn't we make that trade? It's relationships, who you want to work with, what gets out, what doesn't, how that affects the relationship, how much do you want to get out. Like the Geno Smith trade was likely a move made between two familiar parties, right? You got John Snyder and the Seahawks working with Pete Carroll in that situation, who obviously those two are very familiar with, not just Geno Smith, but also the Seattle Seahawks. So they're going to work together, right? The Browns had to get some familiarity with the Jacksonville Jaguars for moving with them. But that's why whenever you look at trades, it's always like the same two teams are always trading with each other, or the same group of teams are trading with each other. The Browns are always trading with the Texans. Back in the day, it used to be the Browns were always trading with the New England Patriots. And that's because the Browns hired a lot of ex-New England Patriot guys. And those were the relationships that they had to seek out and develop these trades with, right? It's not Facebook Marketplace. It's much more complicated than that. And that was very interesting because, even me, somebody who's been covering this for years, sometimes I fall into the trap of thinking like it's Facebook Marketplace. And it's like, it absolutely 100% does not work like that. Like, the market for whoever is going to be in a trade is whoever gets called. And if you're not on that list, then, you're just not in that market. So that is what it is. And if you want to be on the list next time, you got to cultivate that relationship however you can cultivate it. And a lot of this takes planning. Like, if you target a player on somebody's roster, but you don't have a relationship with that GM, you probably got to have a relationship with that GM before you even start talks about trading for that player. Like, think about how much manpower that works and why you can't just do that for every single player in the NFL all at the same time, and why trades aren't as simple and aren't as frequent as we would hope. So there's that. I thought this part was interesting where Andrew Berry talks about his expectations for a top 5 pick, which Mason Graham is. Let's listen to it.
Yes, when you're picking the top 5, you're hoping that player is going to be a cornerstone, a face of the organization for, hopefully over a decade if the guy stays healthy and plays well. It can be like a true organizational pillar.
I would agree with them. If you draft somebody in the top 5, you hope that they're going to be Denzel Ward, right? Like Denzel Ward, Myles Garrett, Nick Chubb to an extent. Like, those are guys who performed and had top 5 pick level careers. And people look to why the Browns haven't added a guy like that anytime soon. And the truth is that those guys were top 5 picks. And you just don't get those guys later in the draft all the time. So for the Browns, they hope Mason Graham is their Cam Hayward, basically. Not the same type of player that Cam Hayward is, but in the same way that the Steelers drafted Cam Hayward in 2011. And it's 2025, and they still have not thought about 3-tech since last year's draft, right? So 14, 15 years of not even thinking about that 3-tech position because you got Cam Hayward. It's the same hope that the Browns have for somebody like Mason Graham. And it's good that we can all agree on the expectation that's set there because that's where Andrew Berry has said it. Now, that doesn't mean that that's what Mason Graham has to be day one, year one, but you do want that result out of him. A top 5 pick has to be more than just a 2-contract player for you, right? A 3-contract guy, somebody who could be on your team for the long run. Somebody we're talking about is part of the identity of the Cleveland Browns, right? Somebody like a Joe Bitonio, right? Who has been here forever. Those are the guys that you want to have be top 5 picks. And I think that's the expectation for Mason Graham in his overall career. So that, I think, is very interesting. If you want to go watch the whole interview, it's on CBS Sports YouTube channel. So make sure you go check it out. But very rare opportunity that you get to have 2 GMs who have traded with each other recently, not just on a show together, but on a show where they're able to discuss the trade in some relative detail that we don't get. And it gives us some insight on how the Cleveland Browns operate, Andrew Berry especially. There's a lot there. There's a lot of meat on that bone, so to say. So that's something to go check out if you want to see more than just the clips that I've put up on this channel. But y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.